Now, you just mentioned the term free markets. Now, I noticed that you wrote an article called Orwellian Doublethink, Nationalize the Banks, Free Markets. What about the term free markets?
Well, the question is free for whom? The free markets today are supposed to refer to what Adam Smith and the classical economists wrote about. When they talked about free markets, they meant a market free of unearned income. A free market was where people would earn what they produced, and that meant the number one aim of classical economics was to tax the free lunch, to tax land rent and interest. And the idea was to have an economy that had minimum property rent or interest that wasn't taxed. The idea was to shift the tax base off labor onto the landlord class and onto the financial class. That's what Adam Smith wrote. It's what John Stuart Mill wrote. That was the ideal. In order to make an economy more competitive, you had to bring market prices in line with the actual cost of production that ultimately could be reduced to the cost of hiring labor, including the labor that made the machinery, labor that made the raw materials. The cost, basically, of most products was reducible to labor. And the idea was to minimize the rake-off of the fire sector. Today, a free market means free for the fire sector, for the banks, and for the real estate sector, any insurance companies like AIG, to essentially loot the economy, to impose toll booths everywhere that it can, toll booths for credit, toll booths for rent, toll booths for public utilities, and to maximize the ratio of interest and economic rent and monopoly pricing relative to overall pricing, leaving less and less for actual costs of production, so that instead of having an economy whose costs reflect what's technologically necessary for production, you have an economy where as much as possible goes for the parasite, for the finance, insurance, and real estate sector.
You have written that Marxists believed that a revolution was necessary to reclaim property rent for the public domain and to enable governments to create their own credit rather than borrow at interest from commercial bankers and wealthy bondholders. You went on to say that the aim was not to create a bureaucracy, but to free society from the surviving absentee ownership power of the vested property and financial interests. And I guess that's just what you've been describing.
Well, the point that you didn't read what I'd written just before that, and the point was made also at this weekend's Eastern Economic Association meeting. Ingrid Rima gave a paper on how Marx was the last classical economist. Marxism aimed at exactly the same objective that Adam Smith aimed for, John Stuart Mill aimed for, in the sense of purifying the economy, of freeing it from the rentiers, from property. But as Adam Smith and Mill thought that this could be done peacefully, Marx said that as a result of the 1848 revolutions, this showed that the bourgeoisie in Europe was not willing to take the final step of really freeing the economy, and in fact, over and above the problems of the carryovers from feudalism, an extractive banking system, and real estate, you had an exploitative industrial system that pitted capital against labor. So Marx said that the ideal of classical economics couldn't be done peacefully. He thought it could only be done by labor organizing to promote its own economic interest. And he was very much against state power, and both he and Engels went out of their way to say socialism is not a large state. Feudalism was a large state. Dictatorship is a large state. Stalinism was a large state. Fascism is a large state. None of these are socialist in the slightest. His idea was of socialism entailed what he called a withering away of the state, just exactly the opposite of a socialist bureaucracy.
Well, then, if Karl Marx was saying that the rentier type economy was not going to go away, that it had to be thrown out, is it beginning to look like he was right?
That would seem to be the case. I'm not sure whether there will be whether there will be a violent revolution. The fact is that it is the recipients of unearned income that have always been violent. It's the rich that have been violent, not the poor. And that's because the rich are defending their free lunch, and people are willing to fight for their free lunch, to kill. It was the Pinochet regime that ended up the most murderous regime in Latin America with Operation Condor. It wasn't the communists regime or the left-wing regimes in the Third World. It's always been the rich that have resorted to violence, not the masses. So the danger is that most violent revolutions are from the right, not from the left. That wasn't something that socialists a century ago confronted.